On this episode of Around the Galaxy, we are joined by Animation Supervisor Hal Hickel. He's the Oscar winner behind The Mandalorian, Rogue One, The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Iron Man. The list goes on. Here we go. Hal, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm great. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much.
It's the pleasure is all ours. So, for the people who may not know who you are just by your face, you are Hal Hickel. You are an Oscar-winning animator, animation supervisor. You have worked on The Phantom Menace and Jurassic Park and all of Mandalorian so far.
Yep.
I have to say, you were. It's a pleasure to. You're the first Oscar-winning guest we've had here on Around the Galaxy. Not my first Oscar Award-winning interview. I actually interviewed Ben Burt. He was my very first interview when I was with Star Wars Galaxy, which is pretty wild. Yeah, so how? It was so. I mean, my first interview. I'm this young kid, and I got to meet. It was actually when he did the special effects IMAX film.
Oh, cool. Yep, yeah. I remember that.
Yeah, it was pretty wild. So, Hal, tell us a little bit about your history, and maybe start with the letter that you wrote to Lucasfilm, the now famous letter that hangs on your wall, I believe.
Sure. I was in the 70s. I was watching a lot of, science fiction horror movies, especially the old Universal horror movies, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, etc. And then I saw King Kong on TV. And that got me all interested in stop motion. That was around 1971, maybe, something like that. And so by the time Star Wars came out in 77, I was already making stop motion films with a Super 8 camera and interested in that craft and visual effects focused on that one little area. So when Star Wars comes out and completely blows my mind and gets me interested in motion control, miniatures, matte paintings. I wanted to know how they did Luke's lightsaber, how they did his speeder, everything. So it really broadened my interest in visual effects. And so I started to pursue that as an interest. And I think it was probably the fall of 77, maybe, whenever it was announced that there's going to be a sequel. And, as they do, this Fox or whoever, or Lucasfilm sent out a press release saying, there's going to be a sequel. And so I got all excited. I was 13, and I got all excited and wrote up some idea, some kid's version of an idea for a sequel. Right. And I sent it off, and I don't know how I got the address because the letter made it to Lucasfilm, and rather than say the fan club, if there was such a thing quite at that point, I assume there was, but and I got a nice letter back, and it was kind of formulaic in that it was saying the usual things about we can't read your story because we have people working on it. And but I had said somewhere in my letter, I just want to come out and work on the movie in any way I can. I'm really interested in special effects, but I'll do anything. I'm 13. It's sure. And charming, I'm sure. And so they said in the letter, getting into Hollywood takes a combination of talent and luck and an agent, I think they said. And but it was very, I was a little bummed because it wasn't like, yes, we're flying you out to Hollywood tomorrow, because I was living on a ranch in Colorado in the middle of nowhere. Right. And I had all these dreams, and but as time went on, but I kept the letter, and as time went on, I realized how cool it was. For one thing, it was on this awesome Ralph McQuarrie letterhead. Right. The other thing I liked, the more important thing really, that again didn't really sink in until I had a little more perspective, was that the letter had been written by Bunny Alsop, who was Gary Kurtz, the producer's assistant. So when I thought about it later, I thought, wow, shouldn't Gary Kurtz's assistant have more important things to do than to answer? Because they must have been getting boatloads of letters from fans everywhere, right? Yep. And so I held on to the letter all these years. And then when we wrapped, when I finally got to ILM as an employee, it kind of tongue in cheek, I had framed it and hung it on the wall behind me.
Right.
Because people, there's loads of people that work at ILM or Lucasfilm who have stories like that, how they always wanted to work there and then finally got there and all that. And so we finished Phantom Menace, and we had a big crew breakfast to kind of celebrate finishing it. And George was there. And ordinarily, while making the film, nobody would ever bother George for an autograph, right? We're all working. We're filmmakers. He's the director. We're just
right.
on with our jobs. But this was kind of a celebration. And some people started to bring up, they might have had a poster by that point because we were getting close to release, or they might have had a crew photo or something. Mm-hmm. And George was super patient and kind, and he sat there at a table, a little line formed. And Rob Coleman, who was the animation director on all three of the prequels, and who I'd become quite good friends with, came over to me and he's like, "Oh, you got to get that letter. Grab that letter and bring it over and have George sign." So I'm like, "No." And he's like, "Yeah, do it." So I went and got the letter and brought it, took it out of the frame and brought it over, and George read it and he kind of chuckled and he underlined talent and luck and wrote, "You have it," and then signed his name. So it was like a big closing of the circle for me. So now I have, now it's signed and it's back in its frame on the wall behind my desk, which I haven't seen for 9 months because we're all working from home.
Yeah, that's wild.
But that's the story.
Do you remember what your pitch was for a story?
No, I mean, I'm sure it was something like, because remember, no one had any idea that his brother and sister, so it was probably something along the lines of, they now have kids, because there had to be kids involved, because I was myself a kid and I wanted to see a kid in it.
Right.
They now have kids and they're on the run from the Empire across the galaxy with their kids, and I'm sure it was something like that.
Right. The sort of perfect story for a 13-year-old. That's great.
Something I could imagine myself being in, even though I didn't have aspirations to be an actor, but it was all sort of exciting to me. Even though I was sort of focused on visual effects, the whole world of filmmaking was kind of exciting for me. So I didn't, the last nice little coda to that letter story is that, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago on LinkedIn, I bumped into Bunny Alsop.
Okay.
So we connected, and I told her that story, and she was super tickled, and I sent her a copy of the letter because she wanted it, and so that was really fun. And I asked her, I said, "What's the deal? Like, how could you possibly have, And she said, "Well, in the months before they shipped off to the UK to shoot Empire, she enjoyed personally answering as many fan letters as she could." That's something she just liked to do. So anyways, that little mystery was solved for me when I talked to her about it.
Oh, that's wild.
That was very sweet. So yeah.
That's so wild. So you went from there and you pursued your dream. I looked through your IMDb and found you worked on the California Raisins stop motion on your way to Toy Story.
Yeah.
Did you have any idea how dramatic an impact on not just storytelling and movie making, but on animation? I mean, since Toy Story, the hand-drawn animation has really almost, I don't want to say disappeared, but it's not what feature films are made of. Did you guys, what was sort of the sense that was happening at the time, or was it, let's see if this works?
I had some sense of it, and I think the reason that I did was because I was coming into it from a completely different discipline, from stop motion animation. So in other words, I wasn't someone who, for instance, had gone to a school to learn computer science, let's say 5 years before that, and then was always sort of immersed in the academia of computer graphics and the state of the art at the time, and was evolving into where Pixar was at. I was coming at it from one of the disciplines in filmmaking that would soon be taken over by it. Now, of course, we still have a very vibrant, in fact, maybe larger than ever, worldwide stop motion community, and that's awesome. But in terms of creating realistic creatures for live action films, that was soon to be that. Jurassic Park was basically the end of that, and that's where I was coming from. I was coming from Will Vinton Studios, where I'd been for 6.5 years doing stop motion animation and knew nothing about computer graphics at all, other than what I'd seen and the making of the behind the scenes making of stuff for Jurassic Park. And So when I got there, I think I was in a good position to be wowed by it and to think to myself, this is really going to change things. But a lot of the animators that were there, almost all of them, in fact, at Pixar at the time, had come from traditional backgrounds because CG was so new.
Right.
And it had been evolving all the way through from the late 70s all the way up to that point where we were in the mid 90s. It was so new that there weren't animation schools all over the world,
right,
awesomely talented CG animators. So most of the animators like me had come from either stop motion backgrounds or hand-drawn animation backgrounds. And then Pixar would just teach you how to use their software, which was pretty user-friendly even at that time. But I got there, and I remember the day that I interviewed for the job. A lot of the film wasn't finished. In fact, when I started, there was probably half the film left to animate, with about 6 months left to do it. But when I interviewed, they showed me the Army Men scene where they go down to reconnoiter the packages and Andy's birthday presents, and I was blown away because obviously it was state of the art at the time. We look at it now, and in some ways it looks a little quaint in terms of lighting and rendering. The animation still bases, but in some of the technical aspects, it's you can see the evolution if you look at Toy Story 4, which is so beautiful. But for the time, it was just like mind blowing. Like, well, how does this? I got a little scared actually because I applied because I had been wanting for a while. Well, I had always wanted to work at ILM, but then Jurassic Park came out, and it was clear that stop motion wasn't going to be the path to get there anymore. And at that point, I didn't know. So in '92, I was a little lost. Like I was happy with my job at Vinton's. It was a great little studio to be at in Portland. But in terms of a career path to getting into visual effects, I was like, well, do I have to go back to school and learn computer graphics? I mean, that's not going to be a thing. Not for me.
Right.
What I didn't know is, like I said, is that these places, ILM, Pixar, wherever, needed animators who understood character animation, and they could teach them and to use the software. But I didn't kind of realize that was the dynamic at the time, and so I didn't. So when I got this very lucky break, because Pixar was behind schedule on Toy Story, and they needed more bodies, they needed more talented animators. Well, I don't say talented, I don't put myself in that category, but they needed more experienced animators to come in to bulk up the crew so they could kind of get through the bottleneck that they were at, and they were casting out feelers all over. And Mike Belzer, who was a stop motion animator in the Bay Area, who was then at Pixar, sent a letter or made a phone call to someone at Vinton's, Teresa Drilling, one of the directing animators there. And she wanted to stick with stop motion. That was her, she loved that. She knew that I was dying to kind of figure out how to get there, how to get from where I was to where ILM was or wherever. And so she told me, but she said, yeah, apparently you don't even know how to switch on a computer. Just don't worry about that. Just, if you can animate, if you have character animation skills, that's what they care about. So I said that real. And so again, I saw that scene, the Army Man scene, and I was a little more than a little nervous. I was like, wow, can I do this? That's amazing stuff. But then that fear started to melt when I got to Pixar, because one of the things I did at Vinton's, not to get too deep in the weeds on this, but I was an animator, but because of my interest in visual effects, I was also kind of the main motion control camera guy. And motion control cameras are cameras on these sort of robotic rigs, like a big carriage that can move them this way and pan and tilt. And I mean, it's all motorized, and the motors are controlled by a computer, and you sort of enter in the positions you want it to be in. And so you can program these camera moves, but they'll be executed one frame at a time. So you can be stop motion animating, but the camera can be moving. And they're also used for shooting miniatures and that kind of thing. So there's an overlap there between stop motion and sort of miniature visual effects. So because I was all keen on visual effects, it was sort of natural for me to kind of move into that role at Vinton's as they got more and more sophisticated motion control equipment. And so what I realized, and again, that didn't make me computer savvy. I just knew how to use this one program on this, sort of very vanilla PC of the late 80s, early 90s variety, and I could run this one program to do the motion controlling. But what I learned when I got to Pixar, and they sat me down and showed me the software for animating characters, was that animating a character in a computer was almost identical to animating this motion control rig. I mean, even though in one case I'm actually animating a physical, basically a sort of robotic machine and giving it instructions on where to go and what to do, the actual way you did that in the software was very similar to posing a character on a given frame, going forward in time, posing it again, and having all these function curves that describe the amount of movement on each of, for instance, the wrist in space and its 3 degrees of rotation.
Right.
You had these function curves, and you'd edit those curves, and that's how you control the movement. And I was like, so as soon as I saw that, I was like, oh, I get this, and I'm actually surprised to see that I've actually been training myself for this job without even knowing it. And then that combined with also being an animator and having at least some skills in that department in terms of bringing characters to life made it all work for me. I think the other thing that helped was that I was excited about it, because there were some other stop motion folks who came on right when I did, who were absolutely brilliant stop motion animators, amazing. But they were there because there wasn't a gig for them at the moment and in stop motion world, and this job was available, but they weren't keen in it, on it. They were like, well, as soon as there's a stop motion gig, I'll be off back to doing that, which I respect.
Yeah.
But I think it made it harder for them to dig it. You know what I mean? It was like, they were kind of muscling through it. They still got great shots and beautiful work, but whereas with me, I was jazzed. I was like, I love this.
And that's one of the things I think that makes the Pixar films and especially Toy Story at the time was it wasn't any CG at the time was still very stiff and you could tell, as you were just saying, I mean, you came from character animation and from that world, and so that they built it that way. And I think that's one of the things to me that's helped push Pixar over the edge to get to that next level. And you were just saying you loved what you were doing, and that makes all the difference, I think. It
helps a lot. A lot. I think the other thing that was great about Pixar at the time was that, and we've come to recognize it a bit as a kind of house style of theirs, and it's harder to see now how unique it was at the time, but the tone of their film, especially of Toy Story, was very different from anything that was out there at the time.
Yeah.
It wasn't one of those things where they tried really hard to be edgy. They didn't. They never crossed a line where you'd be like, who is this movie for? Like, what? But still, they would have jokes that would make grown-ups laugh that maybe kids didn't get.
Yeah.
But they had everything in there that kids would love. Like, it was just the right tone. But it also wasn't a musical. It wasn't a romance. There are songs in it, but there's song segments where song montages. They're not characters singing.
Right.
And I think all those things made it very different from a lot of the feature animation stuff that was out at the time. Even, completely brilliant stuff like, Lion King and Beauty and the Beast and all that. Yeah. It just was a different tone and slightly irreverent, but not too far. And then the look was completely different. So it was a pretty exciting time to be there and be part of that, actually.
And game changing, as I was saying, it really, without Toy Story, you don't get Frozen, right? You don't get the enormous blockbusters that you have now.
Yep.
And so you were just referencing how important it is to love what you're doing. I can only imagine going from that to a few years later working on Phantom Menace. Tell me how you got involved in Phantom Menace and what was that like as a Star Wars fan to be able to suddenly be working on these movies that we never, as fans, never expected to see, always wanted to see, but never expected to see.
Yeah. I mean, well, I'd set my sights on working at ILM when I was, 13 or 14. And, I guess finally getting there this is a joke I make often. So, but, it's a case of chasing your dreams or a case of horribly arrested development that was a job that I was at 13. But I've been, all through the 80s, I'm reading Cinefex. I'm seeing every film that ILM worked on, getting closer. But then, again, once Jurassic Park happened, I didn't see a clear path there. I thought, well, maybe as a motion control camera operator, because that's a big part of their work at the time, but not as an animator now. That's gone. But then when I was at Pixar, and Toy Story was done, and I had shots from Toy Story on my demo reel, and Bugs Life wasn't going to start up for a while. I had a hard choice to make, and because I had the loveliest time at Pixar. I learned more about animation in my year and a half there than probably any other single chunk of time in my life, and I made good friends that are still good friends. But it was just an awesome, exciting place to be. But then, of course, then it was announced that there's going to be a second Jurassic Park film. It's in the pipe. And George is going to make more Star Wars films, which, like you say, was one of those like, wait, what? I never thought that was going to be a thing. I thought that would always be like, man, if I could have been old enough in the 70s to have worked on Star Wars, that would have been so great. It always just seemed like that. Everybody has things like that they're like, I just was born in the wrong time. I really wish I could have done this. So then I had to make the hard choice, and it was hard. It was really hard. I remember going into Pete Doctor's office and giving him the news, and it was tough, really tough. But I was excited too. Obviously, that softened it because I was super excited. And so Lost World was my first project there as an animator. Worked on that. It was an awesome experience. Randy Dutra was the anim soup who had been on the first Jurassic Park with Phil Tippett. And Randy, nobody, I think, in the world knows more about animal locomotion than Randy. He's just a brilliant guy. And so learned a lot from him. Anyways, and then Phantom Menace was next up. And I started getting to know Rob Coleman and kind of bugging him a lot about what kinds of stuff I wanted to animate and where I wanted to be on the film, which he's got this big crew. He's got to decide who to cast stuff with animators and what kind of work to get them. But I was that kind of annoying. Although I would recommend this kind of annoying to young folks looking at this career. I was that guy who, I poked around and found whatever assets were ready to start animating, even though I hadn't been assigned anything. We weren't actually in animation yet. So the first character I found that was ready to animate was a pit droid. And I love robots. Anybody who's ever been to my office at ILM knows that it's jam full of tin toy robots. And so I animated a couple little vignettes of them, like a run cycle and a little thing where one of them stumbles and another one comes running along and steps on his head and whatever. And I showed him to Rob and said, I'm really into robots. So, the first thing he handed me was the droidicas, the destroyer droids, the three-legged ones that roll up in a ball and roll and grab. So, I was slightly annoying and clingy. I got a cool thing to work on, and I really enjoyed it. And then I, was put on different teams under lead. I was just an animator then, but Linda Bell was the lead animator on Watto, and Rob put me on her team, and so I animated a handful of Watto scenes, like the bit where he's like, "What are you waving? What does he say? What are you, some kind of Jedi waving your hand around like that? I'm a Toydarian. Mind tricks don't work on me, only money." Anyway, so that I did those shots, and that was great fun. And so then Rob said, "Okay, I'm going to put you in charge of a character," and he gave me Boss Nass. So I was in charge of Boss Nass, and that was super duper fun. And we didn't have, like nowadays, for instance, his jowls, right? And he does that thing.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we'd do the figure animation and the lip sync, but then we'd hand off all that blubbery jiggle to our creature simulation team, people. And they've got, muscle and fat and skin simulation and all that. But back then, we didn't have all that. In fact, we just had by today's standards, pretty crude cloth simulation we had. So we didn't have to animate that by hand. But the fat thing, I had to animate that all by hand. And we had a really cool set of tools back then, but actually some aspects of it I kind of wish we had today, where you could combine sculpting with animating. And the modelers, I think, were always a little worried because the animators might push it too far, break the likeness of the character, get it off model, that kind of thing. But it really gave us a ton of power because I had these controls in there where I could move his jowls back and forth. But then if something got kind of weird or stretched at the mouth in a way that I didn't like, I could go in with a sculpting tool and fix it. And then save that as a sort of a special control just for that shot, just for that one scene. It wouldn't affect anybody else's scenes that were working with that character or anything like that. So you could sort of fix things. You can it was almost like clay animation. It kind of put me back in that world of clay animation a little bit, like I was doing up at Vinton's. And that was really cool. And it helped enormously on that. But like I said, if we were doing that now, we'd have great flesh simulation to make that all more realistic and jiggly. But he was super fun. He was a lot of fun to work on.
So I'm not 100% clear on the way. So when you get assigned a character, is it almost like you've become the puppeteer? You own you develop and sort of lead the way that character comes to life, right? You're directed, I suppose, by the director. We want him to do this, this, and this. But you get to add personality to that character then.
Yeah. So when a character hasn't been animated in any scenes yet, but we've got some scenes coming up, like Boss Nass, and the animation supervisor comes to you and says, "Okay, you're going to be lead on this character." To begin with, there's a bunch of sort of technical chores, like you'll load the character in and you'll evaluate the rig. And if there's anything about the character rig, in other words, the controls that allow you to sort of move him and pose him, if there's anything about those controls that you think isn't going to serve what's required of that character, you need to give feedback to rigging and say, hey, can we change this a little bit? Can we modify that? So that's one of the jobs, is to just sort of vet the asset, because it's not just going to be you animating it. You're going to have a little team of animators. But you're the point person, right? So that's one thing. Another thing might be, for instance, setting up a bunch of hand poses and saving them so that the other animators, every time they need to make a fist or a point or something, or an okay or whatever, if that's appropriate for the character, that they don't have to then go in and meticulously pose that every time they need it, that those sort of exist. And those are sort of technical things. Then on the creative side, you're kind of finding the character. So one of the things I would do first, just as an exercise really, is a walk cycle. Like I did a walk, that's the first thing I did with Boss Nass, was a walk cycle to sort of figure out his kind of, he's the king of the Gungan, so he's got to be a bit regal, but he's kind of a blowhard. His stature sort of suggests a kind of walk with a lot of kind of weight shift and that kind of thing. So anyway, so then I did that, and by the time I was getting that looking good and Rob was liking it and all that, then we'd get the sequence turned over to us, and there might be 2 or 3 other animators working with me on a sequence, and I'd take some of the shots and I'd assign shots to the other ones, and I would try to sort of set the tone, like okay guys, I've done a smile that I think looks great on Boss Nass. So when he smiles, a genuine smile is what it looks like, but when he's being sly and disingenuous, then maybe it looks like this. Try to set those tones. But then as the animators get into their shots, they start discovering things, and then we all talk about them, what things work, what things don't, incorporating them. But I'm meant to kind of, the lead animator is meant to kind of, set the bar for the character and give everybody else something to aim at, but also give them the space to come up with new stuff and have some authorship over their shots and all that. So, and then yes, so. In terms of the director's role in all this, because there's, above the leads, there's the animation supervisor, or in this case, animation director, which was Rob Coleman. So Rob would, he'd get the download from George on what the scene is, and then he'd convey it to us. And then he'd work with us in dailies every day until he was ready to show the sequence to George. Now, Rob liked to get us FaceTime with George as much as he could. He would still be the direct point of contact for George, but we were encouraged to be in dailies with George to hear the feedback ourselves, even though George is generally talking to Rob. And that's, everything I know about being an animation supervisor, I learned from Rob. Or I feel like anything good I know about it, I learned from Rob. He was great. And not to jump ahead too much, but on Attack of the Clones, Rob made Chris Armstrong and I, we were anim soups by then, and so we were his under anim soups because it was such a huge. The Phantom Menace was huge, but then the shows just got bigger and bigger as the prequels went along. So he decided he needed a couple of under soups, and so on Clones is when I really started to learn how to present work to a director, because Rob insisted that Chris and I present our sequences to George directly, not present them to Rob and have Rob present them to George, which I'll always be enormously grateful for, not only because I learned a lot, but also because that was my one and only chance to work directly with George on a film. And
Yeah.
that obviously is super special.
So what were some of the sequences that that stand out to you that you worked on in Attack of the Clones?
Well, I came onto the show a little late in the process because I had been finishing AI, artificial intelligence, which was my first supervising gig at ILM.
Okay.
So by the time that wrapped, they were well into it. But Rob's like, no, now you're coming on. You're going to help me out. So he started just kind of pushing things at me that were either new, had been added late in the game, or they just hadn't had the bandwidth to focus on yet. And so one of them was the whole droid factory thing on Geonosis. So
Okay.
we had to take all that crazy green screen footage of poor Natalie Portman running through this. That show Wipeout where people run
Yeah.
and they're like spinning things and all that? It was, if you've seen the scene footage, it looks like that, where she's like ducking under stuff and jumping over things and running on these green treadmills and all this. And so we had to look at that and just figure out because I can't remember if this was George's direction or whether it was something Rob thought was important, but somewhere along the way there was the idea that the conveyor line should make some kind of sense. So if you watch that sequence closely, from the moment where they sort of tumble off that little platform and fall into the conveyor belt at the very beginning, to begin with, it's these glowing rectangular or square slabs of metal. And then as it goes along, corners get cut off and they get formed and shaped and all that. By the end of it, they're breastplate pieces for the super battle droids. So there's an actual, it's made up, but there is an actual progression from beginning to end that they're making a real thing that they would be making there, which I kind of always enjoyed. But so we had to kind of retcon that, or whatever the right word is, into what the machines were. Because there was art, Doug Chang's art group had designed a lot of the machines, and those designs had informed the green screen shoot and what whether she was jumping over things or ducking under things or whatever. But we still had to kind of, make all that work and the timing and everything. It was quite complex. So I really enjoyed that. That was super fun. The stuff with 3PO, I cringe a bit now looking at that. And it's not the jokes. It's fine. I get George's sense of humor. But there's some stuff in there where I don't know. I would have done it differently now, let's just say. But there's other stuff in there that I love. I adore. And I like the little Geonosian guys. I like the little mosquito wings and their weird blasters and all that. So they were super fun. They were very Flash Gordon to me.
Yeah.
Which is obviously one of the inspirations, that and Buck Rogers. And I always liked them because they, to me, really harkened back to that whole thing. So there was that whole thing. And then the other big chunk for me was the battle outside the arena at the end. So the sort of proto AT-STs, AT-ATs, and the big Federation ball ship that goes up and gets sliced and then comes back down, and a big explosion of dust and all that stuff.
Kind of look at his that entire sequence it's almost entirely animation, right? It's because there were no actual clone troopers, right? So it was almost an animated movie within the movie. Yeah,
it was. The scale of it for us at the time was quite daunting because remember, this is, big crowds of people were still a very new thing. Weta was obviously breaking ground with their massive software. Would that have been happening yet? Maybe that. I don't know. When did the first Lord of the Rings film come out?
I want to say,
wasn't it?
I think was it 2003, 2001?
Yeah. So we were ahead of that, and it was a struggle, to have thousands of these troopers and all these machines and everything. But we muscled through it somehow. But I think the fun thing for me was, we had these, and folks, I'm sure you'll have many listeners who will know exactly the exact correct name for this machine I'm talking about. But it was sort of the proto AT-AT walker. It's like 6 legs and just looks a little different. That thing was cool and really fun and the way it gets dropped in by kind of a drop ship, which then takes off. Was super fun. And then there were those rolling on the Geonosian side. They had those that sort of missile platform on these 2 big wheels and spider droids, and it was super fun. It was just super fun to work on.
So as the animation team, do you design sort of the do you get to say the ship's going to fly in and drop this and go? Is that, or where does, how much of it is scripted versus okay, go and this is what we want to have happen?
Every project's a little different. In that particular case, George had a previous team working up at the ranch for months and months before Anim ever got involved. Doing sort of simple version of all those scenes, but in CG, not just storyboards, but 3D CG scenes. And so a lot of the shot design came from them. But then, as usually happens, even when there is previs, there's an evolution that just continues all the way through the process. Part of it's editorial. Like the sequence as it's cut when it's handed to Anim is usually not exactly the sequence once we get to the end of Anim. Because for one thing, we discover things in animation that maybe weren't, because previs doesn't typically get into the finer details of the Anim. We start to discover things like, well, this machine should move a little slower if we really want to communicate the sense of weight. So this shot needs to be a little longer, or, that's a simple example, but things like that. But also editorial is working this whole time. And maybe while we're in the middle of executing the animation with the sequence, something comes up where they discover, you know what, it'd be great if we if we eliminated this beat because it's redundant and move this whole chunk of the action forward. And, so stuff like that happens. And I don't recall in that sequence if there were any big relocations like that. But just saying that because of those things, there are opportunities to invent new shots or solve problems or combine two shots. Hey, this would look a lot cooler if we just did it as a oneer where the camera kind of moves and this, that, and the other. And we'll pitch ideas. And so in that way, we can contribute. Now, on other projects, we may just get storyboards or nothing. We just get a hand-wavy turnover. This is come up with something cool for me. That's where we get the maximum amount of sort of authorship over the stuff. But on that sequence, there was tons of great previs from the previous team up at the ranch, and I would say most of our shots evolved out of that, as opposed to being a complete new thing or where we changed the concept entirely. But that was fine. I mean, we there's that whole range, like I say, of projects where and usually every project has the whole range. Like a project will have sequences where they had time to previsit and really dial it in, and other sequences where like, well, previs didn't have a chance to get to that, so we just have some storyboards and you guys are going to have to figure it out. And that's usually how most projects are. And even on Clones, it was like that. Like a lot of the droid factory stuff, there was no previs on that. We had to just figure out what those machines did and how they moved and all that stuff. But the battle outside was much more. We had great, cool previs, and it was fun because George was. I felt like he was experimenting a little bit with his filmic language. Like prior to that, zooms are not a thing in Star Wars, especially snap zooms.
Right.
And that started to creep in because, the guys on the previous team were trying to come up with exciting new ways to sort of shoot the battle and different kinds of shot design and camera work and stuff. And George some of it he pushed back on and was like, I don't think that's quite our language. But, some stuff crept in that gave some of that a little bit of a new feel for Star Wars. Of course, now it's canon. But the time it was like, oh.
Once it's canon, it's in there, right? Once you do a flashback in the sequels, now you can do them, right? So it's funny. And I one of the reasons I asked about that is because, the Star Wars fandom is so studies so many different things. So something that makes sense for you from an animation standpoint to hurry a scene along or to pace it right now becomes, well, that's the way this particular freighter always flies, and then it becomes, and then they watch for it in Rebels or wherever it shows up next.
Exactly.
And so that's
and the classic example of that is we never know what anything's called. Like we're usually always just calling something Spider Guy or whatever, and then later, Lucasfilm comes up with an official name for it because there's gonna be toys and things that need and books about it and everything else. But when we're making it, it's just like in the original films, the medical frigate, we always call it the medical frigate. They just called it the hospital ship. The guy's doing it, building the model and shooting the model. If you see in the notes and paperwork, it's the hospital ship, and so all that stuff comes later. The canonization of everything sort of comes later, which is great. And it's just part of the way it goes.
And the universe just continues to grow, and you have been working on Mandalorian, which
The main reason was Baby Yoda, and that they had zeroed in on a 2D design from the Doug Chang's Lucasfilm art department that everyone liked. But as we were going to move that into a 3D thing, both CG and puppet, they're like, hey, could you just kind of get on some calls and give your ideas on? It was almost like a consulting gig. I mean, but the thing is, the other thing is that I had worked with Jon Favreau on Iron Man